everyone. Welcome back to She Burst Podcast. Today's guest is Elizabeth. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi, Brooke. Thanks for having me today.
Thank you so much for being a guest today. I appreciate it.
It is my pleasure. I've been looking forward to chatting with you.
Me too, me too. So can you tell our listeners a little bit about your story and the book that was, the book that inspired, the book that was inspired by it called Pieces of Me. I couldn't get it out.
I hear you. I totally hear you. It's confusing because the book inspired the movie, but the life inspired the book. So I love that you and I were talking and, finding out that actually I was born in Louisville, Kentucky, right where you're at. And, but my life story started kind of chaotically in that, as early as I can remember, I lived in Alaska and always felt like I was an outsider living in Alaska when I was little, thinking, I don't belong here. Do I belong in this family? Do I belong in this state? Something feels off. Mm-hmm. And later on, I, learned some things about, as I was getting older, about some of my family background, met my father through a lawyer when I was 20. But what I learned was that there was sort of an intergenerational pattern of domestic abuse and later parental childhood kidnapping. And I remember thinking when I realized that my father that I had grown up with for a little bit wasn't my father, I remember making up my mind, like, my children one day will never experience a divorce in the family. There will be no intergenerational violence. There won't be kids finding their parent through a lawyer like I did. And then fast forward, not too much later, I was overseas looking for my kidnapped daughters. I married young, someone I didn't know very well, and didn't do any of the work that it would take to make my good intentions come true. Mm-hmm. And really anything my parents messed up on, I did times 10. It was a hot mess, my marriage. And I left after 4.5 years of an abusive marriage because I was harmed in front of my daughter who was 2. And I remember thinking, if I just make good choices and don't complain too much and, I can get off welfare and I can, get out of the shelter, do what I need to do, I'll create a good life. And really, it just didn't work like that. I feel like the story that I wrote was about my children being kidnapped and taken out of country. And it was an unintended consequence for leaving abuse. I think a lot of times, even today, people feel like, oh, if a person is in a violent or abusive relationship, they just need to leave and make better choices, maybe have better self-esteem, and the problem is solved. It's not necessarily the case whatsoever. And so my children experienced some pretty horrific unintended consequences of my leaving and trying to keep us safe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of people that don't go through domestic abuse, they don't understand how hard it is. Correct. They don't understand the difficulty and to get away from somebody, because you never know if that person may, try to hire someone to kill you or try to sneak up on you when you're not at your best. Right. So people just don't know.
Exactly. And, at the time my kids were kidnapped, it was 4 years after I left. It wasn't like I had left him and he did that in a quick moment of retaliation. Mm-hmm. By that point, I was working as a domestic violence advocate and supporting other survivors. And so I felt like, I was in a safer zone then because there had been so much time. But a lot of the people that I worked with also, if they were in an emotionally abusive relationship and left the relationship, sometimes that was that's what the physical abuse was predicated on, it had always been emotionally or verbally abusive, and then the person left and suddenly abuse escalated. And so it's just important to keep in mind, I think, as we support loved ones or people in the community who are going through abuse, not to necessarily give too much of our opinion on what we think they should do, because we're not going to live with the consequences.
Mm-hmm. That's true. That's true. Out of all the people that I've interviewed, a lot of them have been abuse survivors, and they say exactly what you just said. And I'm like, wow. I was even domestic. I wasn't physically abused because my mom is crazy. So my mom will hurt the guys. She would hurt them. I know she will. But I was emotionally abused. And my mom I don't like telling her, like, if I get in a relationship, I don't like telling her that I'm in a relationship because she might scare the guy off.
You
But
kind of hide it.
yeah, yeah. Oh man, she's something else. but, but exactly what you're saying, like it is scary, and yeah, I don't know, like I don't know. So, what have you done to help domestic abuse survivors and people that are going through it?
Well, one of the things that I did was work as a domestic violence advocate, and it was at that amazing job with some of my best friendships ever made and people that I really admired, and still admire. You know, my old supervisor, Heather, was a woman named Heather, my friend Jennifer, so many different friends, Sally, different advocates. We learned to support one another as women as we did the very difficult and sometimes dangerous work. Back when I was doing it, you know, domestic violence hasn't always been illegal in our country. I think people forget that. It
Yeah.
wasn't always illegal to discipline, quote unquote, one's wife, as an example. And so this was a long time ago that I worked as a domestic violence advocate. And so I got to work with law enforcement and judges and teachers and welfare workers in the system to help them understand the dynamics of abuse. And this was, like I said, way back in the day before we talked about it very openly. It was while my kids were missing that Nicole Brown Simpson was killed. And, you know, I think sometimes as a country, especially United States, if something happens to a celebrity, suddenly we care about the issue that happened. And so it was horrible that she was murdered, but it created a conversation about a topic that had been very private. And so there were more opportunities to really talk about it. Later, I went to work as a child abuse investigator, and then finally as a juvenile probation officer and supervisor. And a lot of those same kids that I met as infants, as a domestic violence advocate, I saw later in child abuse investigation, same kids, then later in juvenile probation, because this is the kind of thing that if it happens in a child's life, it doesn't just go away because the relationship ended. There is a legacy it leaves and an imprint. And so I did that work. Today, I am a retired government worker. And of course, I wrote my book about my own story that became a movie premiering in March of 2022 on Lifetime this month. But I also have a miniature course that I have online helping people understand what to say when someone they know is being abused. Because what we say or what we don't say is pretty important. We're already impacting the abuse dynamic just because we live around it by the things we think and say and do or don't do. But we want to make the right impact. We want to make the intentional one and not get overly invested in the outcomes of victims.
Yeah, that's true. And ever since I started my podcast, people that have been sexually abused by their husbands and stuff, they privately message me, and some of them are scared to go to go get help. So sometimes if they ask me, then I will go down there with them. I've had people ask me to go down there with them. I'm like, really? You want me to go down there? What am I gonna do? But I guess it's like just for support, I guess.
Right.
I don't know. Like, but people reach out. They do reach out. And exactly what you just said.
I think that's one, and I love that you do that, Brooke. I think one of the things that I really appreciate about local domestic violence agencies is people don't understand that the job of an advocate is not to tell a survivor / victim to leave or to stay. That's never their job. They help safety plan and they provide advocacy and information and support, because inside all of us, we can make our own best choices.
Right.
But we can't assume what the best choice will be for that person. And so always knowing what local resources are around us is really helpful too.
Exactly. That's true. I think I'm going to look it up what's in my city and make sure I post it on my website, because I haven't found any. Like, I need to reach out and look at stuff. I really do.
There is a lot in Louisville, and I always encourage people, even in my tiny little course, I say, hey, look look at the top, let's say the subject, you could call it intimate partner violence, or you could call it domestic violence, put it in your search engine plus, and then your community. Even if you're, let's say, in Vietnam, domestic abuse services, Hanoi, as an example, and up will come some resources. Maybe those resources during the pandemic are online, but nevertheless, they are resources. And so in Louisville, or in where I live in Chattanooga, if you have done this since I've moved here, all of the different services will pop up. So you know what to tell that person, who can sit with them in court and not judge, who can sit with them in a group support setting and help them kind of unpack what's going on.
That's true. That's true. So how did you find the courage to leave your abusive relationship?
Well, thank you, Brooke. It took a while because mine, like you talked about, my relationship was primarily controlling and verbally abusive from the beginning. And I didn't even see it as controlling or verbally abusive. It just felt like what was normal. Exactly. Unfortunately. Yeah, it felt like what was normal. It felt like home. And then one day I challenged his authority ultimately and ended up being strangled on the floor in front of my 2-year-old daughter. And he was very serious when he did this. It wasn't to harm. I knew very quickly that this could have been the end. And so my daughter was watching and she was screaming. I was at a time in my life, and at that point when I was in my mid-20s, I didn't say to myself, I deserve better, even though obviously everyone deserves better than that. No one deserves to be abused. I didn't think that. But what I thought was, my daughters do not need to grow up watching this. And so that day I decided to leave, and I did not go directly to a shelter because nobody wants to think they're that person, and that's how I thought of it, was I don't want to be that person, quote unquote. So I called a friend, and he had disabled my vehicle. And so a person I know paid for a taxi to take the kids and I to a friend's house. And we didn't tell him where we were going, and he tracked us quickly. And then I ended up in the shelter because that was a safe place to be. I'm so thankful that I had to go there, because there is no substitute for that kind of support, and people in that professional role can help a survivor understand local judges and the actual protocols, not just what they're supposed to do, but what they actually do in their community. They can help them understand what services are out there to support them. They can connect them with great resources. And the support you get from other survivors for whatever you're going through, the peer support, you learn so much more from that than even though therapy is wonderful and I endorse it, but really this is a situation where peer support is fabulous. So I was very lucky to be that unlucky that I went to stay in the shelter and then get support.
Yeah, it is good, because in the shelter, there's people that have been through what you've been through, so they can relate and they can help you, and they understand and they can listen instead of just giving their opinion. They can, so I agree. So I did want to ask you, I haven't watched the movie yet. I am going to watch it, but what happened to your ex-husband? Like, is he in prison for what he did? Like,
nope, not at all. Not at all. So he is, as near as I can tell, still living in Greece, and I was arrested, in Greece when I was attempting to exit the country with my kidnapped daughters. He was arrested ever so briefly and released. So nothing of any consequence really happened to him that I can tell, as far as the justice system. And, that's that. I mean, I don't have contact with him at this time. My daughters don't either. I will say my kids have great relatives in Greece. My former husband's family, a lot of them were amazing. And so I still have his, my nephews and nieces by marriage. By that marriage, I never did remarry, but I have them on my social media, and frankly, I adore them. And so they have some connection with their family there through social media only, but they haven't any contact with him. They've not been back. And my daughters are now happily in their mid-30s. And, I'm so pleased. And, they're very smart and brave and nice, quirky girls. Women,
Yeah.
I should say,
So,
women.
so do you educate them like my mom does me about domestic abuse and stuff? Like my mom, she doesn't take men hitting women at all. My
Right.
mom, I already told you about my mom. My mom is not, she's not down for that at all.
She's
So,
coming after him.
oh yeah, she will. But
Right.
so do you educate your daughters on domestic abuse like my mom does me and tells me about it and teaches me about it and how to go about it?
Right. We have had so many conversations, even before they were old enough to date, about, and not even just in dating relationships, but in relationships we choose, that we want to be valued, we want to feel equal, we want to be feeling emotionally, physically, and otherwise safe. And certainly in dating relationships. And I think the most important thing, and don't get me wrong, when we raise our kids, then they grow up and they make their own choices. So it only goes so far and they have the freedom to make their own choices. However, I think one of the things we talked about as far as some of my mistakes, choosing someone so kind of young and not knowing him, or was the fact that I didn't even know myself. The most important person you can know in a relationship before you get into it is really yourself. And knowing what your strengths are and the things you want to work on are, and your own value, and having belief in that, and being able to support yourself so that if you get in a relationship that for any reason ends, whether it's by death of someone accidentally or by illness or through abuse, that both parties have the ability to make their own currency, their own money, and they don't feel so dependent and crushed.
Yeah, that's really great. That's really great advice. So, how did you feel when you were told that Lifetime wanted to tell your story?
That was so exciting, as an author, and certainly as someone who didn't have a literary agent either, even the chances of that actually happening are pretty slim and none. So at first I thought that, okay, they'll option, meaning they'll rent my story rights, but probably they wouldn't make it, in my opinion. Even though I was told they were very, very interested. The original production company was Cineflix through Canada, a wonderful company. And an executive producer, Jeff Vanderwall, really loved my book. He literally read it and read it again and loved the book. And that surprised me, because actually men weren't my target audience, but it just was so nice that he liked it. But then, they optioned rights. I thought, well, maybe. And then optioned it a second time, which was kind of hopeful. And then the pandemic came and I quietly thought, well, that'll never happen. And then sure enough, once they decided that Lifetime was interested, the first company had to sell the idea to Lifetime. And when Lifetime went with it, it was like, and it was surreal. It was exciting and very anxiety producing, truthfully. And because you never know, as an author, I didn't write the script. I love the script writer, but I didn't write the script. So it was, it was their story. Once you sign away your rights, it's their story. They can do what they like. And, I hoped that no one would be hurt. I hope that people got the message, and it certainly wasn't that, anything anti-anything. It wasn't, oh, Greek men are bad. No. It was a very wonderful, hopeful story about Greece and about community and support and the things we can do when we band together. And they got it. I was so thankful. They just wrote a very lovely story. And I watched the movie after it premiered, but I watched the movie about a week and a half afterward. And I think they did a lovely job.
I can't wait to watch it today. I'm going to watch it today.
I'm excited. Oh, thank you, Brooke.
So can you tell our listeners about a few of your upcoming events?
Absolutely. I love a few things that I do. I'm writing some more, books. So I have a book that's with an editor right now. And it's more of a book about, because a lot of times survivors have reached out and said, how can I manage what this thing that I'm going through, my own crisis? So it's really about some of the things that helped me along the way. I worked in the very system after I was a survivor that sometimes failed me hard. And so some of it is just working with systems. How do you survive government systems, law enforcement systems, those kind of things when you feel like you don't have any power? And create the space to have not just an okay life after your crisis, but a good one, a life that not perfect, because Lord knows mine isn't, it's still filled with plenty of struggle and dysfunction, but how do you create more stability for yourself and create space for something neat? So working on that, I teach book marketing on This Skinny, and that is for authors, independent authors who are introverted and not techie. And I teach that a couple of times a year. So I'm going to be doing that very soon. If someone's interested, they could sign up on my website for the wait list. And then I do a lot of speaking things. So I've got a couple coming up soon in the next couple of weeks, actually with another woman named Brooke coming up on Tuesday. I love Brooks. Brooks are my favorite. And, I have an ongoing class. It's I think less than $20, but it's to help with when someone is being abused. And that's on an ongoing basis, a series of videos I created. And so that's what I do as part of my at-home business. And then I podcast at Persistence U with Lizbeth. And U is in university, like persistence, the letter U. Because during the pandemic, I had watched how we eat each other alive on social media, frankly. And the last many years, it has just been brutal. And hearkening back into a time pre-internet when I was going through my own crisis, and when so many beautiful people across the globe, some who knew me and many who did not, put down any of our differences and stepped up to help. I really wanted to reach back to that and have the stories of survivors and strivers to inspire people. So it's a 30-minute weekly podcast. And, I try to invite community there.
Nice. I love it. I love it. I love what you're doing.
Thank you, Brooke. I love what you're doing. I really do. I love that you give voice to people in similar circumstances.
Yeah, thank you so much. I did want to ask you one final question. What advice would you give my listeners who want to help the domestic violence?
Low battery.
To help people who are going through domestic violence?
I would say, Brooke, that absolutely believing, if they have someone who's talking to them about what's going on, believing that person, suspending any judgment, but not taking on the issue themselves and try to fix it or rescue that person, but know what your local referrals are. If you want to make an impact yourself more directly, I would say get training at local agencies that deal with domestic abuse and become a volunteer or donate money or clothing or whatever it is they're taking. But when it comes to the actual work, I would definitely say believing, listening, suspending judgment, and referring. And so often, the reason I did my tiny little course online is because I think so often we feel like, oh, this person I care about is going through something awful. I'm going to reach in. I'm going to be all things to her or him. I'm going to fix it. They can live with me. They need money. I'm going to write them a check. I'm going to really show up big. And then what they get mad about is that friend doesn't always stay in the same mindset of leaving. They go back. Sometimes several times, and then you feel a real betrayal because you put yourself out there. So I would say, try not to be that everything solution, but refer the person to the solution while you're giving them support.
That's really great advice. I have had a few people that they will get mad at you for going back, but people, it's like they don't understand.
Right.
And they can't help what they don't understand. And I agree. That's really great advice. I'm definitely going to do that. Try to reach out and stuff and help domestic abuse, because I know quite a few in my city. So yeah, I'm gonna reach out.
I love that. Well, you'll be perfect because you're compassionate and empathetic, and so I think that's going to be fantastic.
Thank you so much. I want to thank you so much for coming on my podcast today and chatting with me.
I have loved every bit of it, Brooke. Thank you so much for having me. I love the work you're doing.
Thank you. You too. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.